So today's lesson is on the dispersion effect, which is a really popular Photoshop technique for taking a subject and making it look like they're dissolving into little bits. And those bits can be very, very simple, or they can become very complex. Now, it can be a little hard to wrap your head around what you're doing when you're creating a dispersion image, so I just want to break it down into the simplest parts. Number one, you need a background that has the subject removed from it. Number two, you need an isolated subject with no background that you can erase little bits from. And number three, you're going to need a layer with all the little bits that are drifting off your subject. Okay, so let's begin with creating our background. So the first thing you're going to do is look for a large image with a subject in it that you like. This one here is a little bit small. You're going to need to have space for the trails of the dispersion to drift away from the subject, and the edges here are a little bit too close. So I'm going to expand the edges using the crop tool. Now, expanding the edges is easy. Once you go to the crop tool, oftentimes when you just click on the crop tool the first time, it will give you these control points, and as soon as you drag one, it actually puts a 3x3 grid here, which helps make it easy to figure out where your focal points are. So remember the rule of three. Generally speaking, you want your focal point to line up here. It's not a big concern for right now, but it is a handy thing to have. Now you can use crop to cut parts out of the picture, but you can also expand the picture by dragging the bounds outside. And if you hit OK, you can see we've now got a larger image, but the background has not filled this in. It actually gets filled in with whatever your background color is here. So we're just going to undo that because there's actually a much easier way to expand the image without having to fill stuff in. And that's just to click up here the content aware option. So now on my crop tool here, drag out the box to select the whole thing. Now when I drag this over, because I want room for the trail to come off of her, and hit OK, it will use the content aware fill and kind of automatically clone areas of the background into this area here. So that worked out really well. Now if it had grabbed part of her foot, which is a possibility, I could just switch to the clone stamp tool, just manually get rid of that. But this has worked quite well, and it can work well even on fairly sophisticated backgrounds. If you were to take this one here and wanted to expand it a little bit, did this, see, that doesn't look bad at all. I mean, it's certainly not perfect, but since people aren't going to be paying much attention to the background, there would be nothing wrong with just leaving it like that. Okay, so now that we have our background, we've got to remove our subject from the background. And I think the easiest way to do this is to make a layer, to duplicate this layer. Go up to Duplicate Layer, copy, or the shortcut is Control-J. And then we'll just turn that top layer off. We're going to need that one in a minute. But for now, we're going to go back to Layer 1 here, and we're just going to go to the lasso tool. Whoops. Draw a simple selection on your subject. I kind of missed a part over there, so I'm just going to add that part in. And then we'll right-click inside, go to Fill, and go to Content Aware Fill. And then this should do a pretty good job of just removing her. And again, you could do the same thing on a more sophisticated background like this. Draw around your subject, Fill, Content Aware Fill. And again, it's not going to be perfect, but it doesn't have to be really accurate at all. The only time we're going to see this part of the background is through the little holes we'll eventually create in our figure. So usually a content aware fill will be fine. So I'm actually going to call this background. So now we have a copy with our figure, but this figure still is attached to the background, and we need to change that. So I'm going to start with a subject select. There we go. Now, if your subject had a lot of hair that was kind of bushy or wispy, you would want to go to the Select and Mask tool, kind of draw along the edge of that hair with the Refine Edge brush. But since her hair is kind of pulled back, I don't really need to do anything else here. So I'm going to go directly to layer mask. So now if I turn the background layer, we can see that we have our subject totally isolated, which is good. So I'm going to call this subject. Now I'm going to make a copy of her. So I'll use the shortcut Control J, and I'm going to call this dispersion. All right, now that we have our dispersion layer here, we're going to do something that we don't often do, and that is apply this layer mask destructively. And now there's a reason why we're going to do it. It's going to make our lives easier in a few minutes, and I'll show you why when we get to that point. But what you do is click on the layer mask to select it, right click and say apply layer mask. And what that does, if we turn the background layer off, is it basically just erases everything that the layer mask was hiding. We're now going to go up to a new tool we haven't used before, and that is under Filter and Liquify. This is a really fun tool which can do all kinds of things. If you've ever watched videos about how they manipulate models in magazines and change the size of everything, this is the tool that they use. We're just going to rely, though, on the top tool for the moment, the forward warp tool. Imagine that the subject here is painted with wet paint, and this brush is you basically sticking your finger in and smearing the paint along. And what you want to do is think about the pattern of the dispersion. So this is where you're creating the tendrils that are coming off of the figure. So you want to give a little bit of thought to what body parts you want to be sort of fading away, and how do you want them to kind of trail off. So I'm going to take her leg, for example, and I'm going to start stretching her leg out. So you just pull and click to kind of smear this. You can go over the same area multiple times. Don't worry, it's going to look really weird and distorted. I'm going to make the brush just a little bit bigger for this part here. It's a little easier to pull bigger areas with a bigger brush. So it's better to pull this bigger than you think you need it. So I'm going to go right off the page. Also going to take the edge of her skirt here. I want to grab a little bit of her head, but I think I'll shrink the brush for that. Back to 107, and we'll just pull a little bit of her face off. I know it looks weird. A little bit off there. Okay, so this is going to give us the area where we're going to create the little bits that are coming off of her. I will show you one thing. If you do too much, if you go to the Reconstruct tool and basically paint over the area, it will return it to the way it was when you started. So if you don't like something you did, that can be used to undo the effect. But I do kind of want it, so I'm just going to pull it back out. Try not to do what I just did and pull the other side of the arm or the image. You don't want to move the entire thing. You just want to pull out one side. So because I've pulled out the other side of the arm, I'm just going to try to pull that back a little bit. Doesn't matter if it's messy here, you just don't want a big gap. This is fine for us. Hit OK. Now here's why we had to apply that layer mask. Because if we had not applied the layer mask, we would get this. You would have the layer mask would hide all of the areas that we just pulled out. You'd still see the distortion in the original selection area, but that doesn't help us very much. We want to see all the bits coming off, and the layer mask would be blocking that. If we turn the layer mask off, then we have all the background again, and then we'd have to separate the background from the image. You can do that. You could use the select subject and the selection tools, but it's a bit of a hassle. So it's much, much easier if we just get rid of the layer mask and apply it before the filter effect. Okay, so now that we have our three separate layers, our dispersion, our subject, and our background, we need to work on kind of merging them together. We're now going to add a new layer mask to the dispersion effect because we really don't want to see all of this as a big solid block, obviously. So let's click on the dispersion layer. We're going to go down to layer mask. Now if you hold down Alt while you create the layer mask, it will create a layer mask that's already pure black. Otherwise it defaults to creating it pure white, and then you've got to invert it, Control I, to make it all black. So this is now hiding all of the layer, but if we go to our paintbrush, switch our foreground color to white, and paint over, where is she? Okay, there. We paint over down here, for example, it brings back some of that trail. Now, obviously we don't want to bring it back like this. This doesn't look very good. Also, I just illustrated the problem of not knowing exactly where the trails are. You can't see them. So I'm going to Control Z to undo that. And then we're going to do something so we can see where the trails are. So in this dispersion layer, if you go up to the properties window here, when this is selected, you need to have the layer mask selected. If you reduce the density of the layer mask, you then can see through it. But this allows us to kind of paint over top of it because now we know exactly where the bits are that we want to reveal. So if I paint some white on here, then I can boost this back up when I'm done to 100, and we've got our little spots showing through. So that's a little trick that just allows you to see through the layer mask if you need to figure out where your trails are. However, these kind of dots, I mean, we could do a dispersion with these kinds of dots, but it's not the most effective or interesting way to do it. So we're just going to undo that. We'll put this dispersion back up to 100 for the time being. So this is the time where you're going to need to make some decisions, because the kind of brush you select for this part of the project totally defines the shape of the dispersion. So is the person dispersing into squares for a pixelated effect? If so, you choose a square brush. If you want them to disperse into little bits, you would choose one of the scatter brushes. You can have them disperse into bats or birds or, I don't know, literally anything that you can think of. So you may want to import some custom brushes for this, and I will include some videos on how to do that on the Spark page. We're going to use brushes that I'm pretty sure are default Photoshop brushes. So we're going to pick one of these because we're going to create sort of a nice scattered effect for our disintegration. Now these brushes come with some presets already set on them. If you go to the brush panel window, you can see that shape dynamics is already on. So these brushes already are set to vary by size. They're set to scatter kind of randomly when you paint, so you don't have to worry about clicking around. You don't have to manually make the pattern. It will make it for you. So let's reduce the density here a little bit so we can see what's going on. And then I'm going to make the brush a little bigger, and I'm just going to start kind of painting this in. And just as I click, you can see how it's spreading all of these dots all over the place. So I'm going to spread some up here, I'm going to reduce the size a little bit, add a few. Now, one of the tricks is the closer you are to the subject, the more dense you want the particles to be. So as if they are getting more faded as they get further away. And you can see why it's a good idea, if I zoom in, you can see why it's a good idea to stretch out during the liquefy phase. Stretch this out longer than you need, because if you have dots like this that are cut off, it's going to kind of ruin the illusion a little bit. It's going to make it clear that there was an edge, which you really don't want. So it can really be helpful to make this wider than you think you need. Now, if this happens, you can easily just switch to black and then just sort of, with the same brush even, kind of paint over those areas just to hide some. But you can go back and forth like this, painting with black, painting with white, until the dispersion looks the way that you want it. Pump it back up to 100 and you'll see exactly what it's going to look like. Now, there's nothing wrong with having the subject layer turned on during this stage, And in fact, having it on can help you figure out where the areas should be the most dense, where there should be the most bits showing through. So I'm going back to my dispersion layer mask, switching back to white, shrink the brush a little bit, and I'm going to paint some more white areas so that more things show through closer to where the edge of the actual subject is. So this involves a lot of going back and forth, switching between white and black, changing sizes, trying to hide any obvious lines that crop up. And just so that you know, if you need to, you can always click on this layer, go back to the liquefy effect, and modify it. If you decide, oh, well, I really want this to be sticking out a little more, so there's more to play with, you can grab this and move it around, hit OK, and it will make those changes. So you're not locked into the distortion that you originally set. You can modify it at any time. Then the next step is to take the subject. We're going to go to the subject layer mask, and now we want to sort of distort or erase the edge or along the edge of the part of the subject that's disintegrating. Right now, there's bits coming off of them, but they still have a very defined edge, and we want to get rid of that edge. So it makes sense to use the same brush here, although I'm going to shrink it. You can use the square brackets to decrease and increase the size of the brush. Also, I'm switching to black because I want to hide parts of her leg. And so now I'm going to paint along the edge of her leg. One thing that's happening here is because the scattering effect is so high, I'm deleting parts almost on the other side of the leg that I don't really want to do. I don't want to delete that far over, but because this brush is set to scatter so much, it's hard for me to control where these dots appear. I'm just going to open this up, go to the scattering, and just turn the scatter down a little bit. And you can see the preview down here. The higher the scatter is, the further apart the dots get, and then it's much harder to control where they go. So I'm just going to put them up to something like that. And then when I paint, it gives me a lot more control over where those bits erase. So I'm erasing by painting black over the foot. Now, because this is a layer mask, it's non-destructive. If I do too much, if I don't want those dots, I'll just switch to white, paint over them. Whoops. I might need a more accurate brush for that, because don't forget, this is also the layer mask that's hiding the background. So if I click over here, I'm bringing some of the background back. And when you paint white over the background here, remember that we used the content-aware fill to kind of fill this layer in on the background, which means it's not exactly the same on this layer as it is on this layer. It's a little, you can see it's a little bit whiter. It's a little lighter in value, so we can see those paint marks. And we don't really want to see those paint marks. So if you accidentally paint onto the background and you can see it, all you have to do is switch to black and just paint over those bits. Now, don't paint into her leg, because then you'll lose part of the leg. But black will get rid of any little bits on the background that you accidentally add. White will get rid of any little dots on her leg that you erased that you didn't actually mean to erase. And you can go in and take care of that. So that's really how the effect works. It's all about trying to create an interesting blend here of erasing bits from the original subject so that they blend with the bits that you're creating from the dispersion. And that's something that's going to take a little bit of artistic decision-making on your part about when it looks good. But there you go. That is the basics of how you do a dispersion effect. And it doesn't matter what kind of brush you use. If you use a smoke brush, you can get these cool, wispy, smoky effects. You can have them dissolve into flowers or butterflies or anything else that you can find a custom brush for. So go forth and experiment. This can be a lot of fun once you understand the technique. I'm interested to see what you come up with.